Well, kids, you're dismissed for a rambunctious, not a rambunctious, no, keep it quiet now back there, okay. So, for a good kids service, and so we'll let you go ahead and leave now. So our sermon today is called, When God Turns the Tables. So we're going to finish up our study of Esther today. Last week we left off at the end of chapter 4, and Queen Esther had resolved herself to go see Queen Xerxes uninvited. And her famous quote was, "Though it is against the law, I will go to see the king. If I must die, I must die." And so we left on a cliffhanger, waiting to see what the king would do. If anybody needs notes, they're right out in the lobby. Just feel free to get up and go grab some notes there. Sorry. So this major cliffhanger. And I thought about just letting you guys sit on this for a while, just really building it up. But in chapter 5, we read that the king does indeed hold out his scepter to Queen Esther, and so she's not killed. Whew, it would have been a short book, would have been a lot shorter. But instead, he even says, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Okay, now let's be honest. He didn't really mean that. He wasn't giving away half the kingdom. He had 127 provinces. If Esther had said, "Okay, that sounds good. Okay, I'll take Italy and Egypt with the pyramids and like all the beachfront stuff. I want that." This would have been a whole different story, right? If she had said that. But this was simply the king's way of saying, "I'm in a good mood. What do you want?" And so Esther could have immediately blurted out what she really wanted was, "Well, I'd actually like you to fire your chief of staff and reverse your decree to kill all the Jews." That's what she really wanted. But she couldn't say that. But she was wise, and she understands the king. And instead, she does something brilliant. She says, "King, I would like to throw a banquet in your honor. And, by the way, bring Haman." You remember Haman, he's the bad guy. He's the chief noble of the empire here. So we've got a picture here that shows this first banquet. Can we see that picture here? And so it's kind of dark, but this is by Rembrandt. And so this was painted in 1660. And so you see the king in the middle, Esther, and then Haman on the side there. And the king says, "Ooh, I like parties, especially parties about me, and I'll be there." And you can only imagine how happy Haman is to be invited because it's all about him. It's a party just for the king and me. I must be really important. I knew I was important. But it's good that the king knows that I'm important and the queen. Just the three. Oh boy, imagine the influence I can get out of this. So at this banquet, the queen invites them to attend another banquet the next day. So she's kind of just playing cool here, and Haman just leaves on cloud 9. He is so excited. He's in the exclusive club now. There's nobody in the kingdom more important than he is. At least he was happy until he is leaving the palace and he sees Mordecai sitting there, still not giving him any respect, still not bowing to him, and he is enraged, as he often is. We're about to come to the climax of the story, and there are a couple of more banquets thrown. There's a lot of banquets here. But let's take a moment to check in on Haman. So Haman has wealth and power and influence. And yet this one man, Mordecai, refusing to bow down to him is just consuming him. He can't stop thinking about it, can't stop talking about him. So eventually his wife says, I have an idea. Why don't we build a 75-foot pole and ask the king to impale him on it? 75 feet, huh? That sounds pretty good. Brilliant! Let's do it. And so while they're building this pole, something unexpected happens. And this is where the fingerprints of God start showing up everywhere. You see, the night before the second banquet, the king can't sleep. And this is before we had melatonin and, the sound machines that was in the... Anybody have a sound machine to sleep? You can get like the rain or the ocean. And I was... this is a long time ago. We lived in Hawaii. And so some friends... And there was about 10 of us that went to this beach house that somebody owned in the church. And so we're in this beach house, and I'm lying there, and I hear the TV. It's just like on static. I was like, and it's like cranked up. I was like, what in the world? So it's like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I was like, that's somebody made a mistake. So I go in and turn off the TV. Well, the next morning, I found out that the owner of this beach house has a beach house, but doesn't like the sound of waves at night. Keeps him up. So he turns on the static on the TV. Oops, my bad. So sorry, But so anyway, King Xerxes can't sleep. And so the next best thing that he has is he has somebody come and read government documents to him. Because nothing says, put me to sleep like public documents, right? And so they begin reading, and here is where it just appears to be a complete coincidence. Oh, boy. And they read a section about Mordecai saving the king from assassination. And the king suddenly asks, hey, did we ever do anything for that guy? Did we ever? And they say, let me check. Nope, we didn't do anything. And at that exact moment, Haman walks into the palace. And the king asked Haman, hey, Haman, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? And Haman, of course, is thinking it was him and is going to be honored. He's like, oh, well, here's what you should do. You put the royal robes on him and let him ride one of your horses throughout the city and for everyone to see and make a big parade of it. And the king says, great. Haman, go do this to Mordecai. Can you just imagine what Haman's face looked like? So now we're at the next banquet, and I think we have another picture here. Oh, this is Mordecai on the horse and Haman leading him around. This is painted by Botticelli in 1470. And it's pretty accurate horse for 1470. He's got 4 legs and, so only one tail. That's really good. Now, there's way too many at that exact moment situations in Easter. So I want you to write this down in your notes. A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. The God who appears absent is actually arranging everything behind the scenes. Nobody in Esther sees the whole picture, do they? Everyone sees these pieces, but God sees the entire puzzle. We have seen this pattern repeating before, haven't we, in the last few weeks with Ruth and now with Esther? And isn't it reassuring to know that God works the same way with people throughout time? Well, let's pick up the story in chapter 7. We're going to start that today, and I invite you to open your Bibles to Esther chapter 7. We're going to read the first 10 verses here. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replies, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, and I think we have a picture of this. Let's see. So this is painted by Ernest Normand in 1888. And this is the pivotal scene here. Esther replies, "This wicked man, Haman, is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out of the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. Just as the king was returning from the palace garden, the king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Wow. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Now, who said the Bible was boring? You know, this is pretty exciting. So this brings us to our second point. The king, evil overreaches, and God uses that. Evil overreaches, and God uses that. Haman's pride was his undoing, wasn't it? He built the gallows publicly, 75 feet tall. He wanted maximum humiliation for Mordecai. Instead, the very height of the gallows became the measure of his own disgrace. Pride that goes too far always exposes itself. Haman's downfall began long before this moment. It began with pride. Proverbs 16:18 warns us, pride goes before destruction, and haughtiness before a fall. I don't know if I have a good definition for haughtiness. I think we've all seen haughtiness, haven't we? We would know it if we saw it. I don't know. It's fun to say haughtiness. Haughtiness. It's one of those old-fashioned fun words. Pride convinces us that we deserve more than others, that we know better than God, and that our plans matter more than His. But this is not over yet, because then the king now needs a new chief of staff, and so he asked Esther, because he always asked everyone else what he should do. So he asked, "Who should be my chief of staff, Esther?" She says, "I don't know anyone more qualified than Mordecai." So Mordecai gets Haman's job and the wealth and the property that goes along with it. And then Esther says, "By the way, king, there's still that unalterable edict that you gave all the Jews that would be slaughtered and killed, and what are we going to do about that?" So in chapter 8, King Xerxes gives Esther and Mordecai permission to write a note to the Jews telling them whatever they want to tell them. He gives them permission. And it's interesting that the Bible notes that this was on June 25th that they get permission to write this note. It's also interesting that Haman, when he had written a note, he had rolled a dice called a pur, P-U-R, and it came up with March 4th, I think March 7th, as the day that the Jews were going to be killed. So let's go and let's pick it up in chapter 9 here. So on March 7th, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. But no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. You see what God did? He didn't erase the calendar. He didn't erase March 7th. He redeemed it. The same day, the same moment, but an entirely different outcome. Now let's skip down to verse 20. Verse 20. Mordecai recorded these events. How far am I reading? Only to 22. Okay. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness and by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. All right, let's skip down to verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. These letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time, decreed by both Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther. The people decided to observe the festival just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was written down in the records. And I find this fascinating. The festival of Purim is still celebrated today. The name, as you can imagine, the name Purim comes from the name of the dice, Pur, and they get the Purim. But I was reading, and there is elaborate festivals with like costumes and food and giving of food and stuff to the poor, and it's just apparently it still goes on. That's absolutely amazing. So our next point here is they institutionalized the memory. They institutionalized the memory of God saving them. Mordecai, he didn't just throw a party. Hey, we won, this is great. He wrote letters. He established an annual festival. He ensured that what God had done would not be forgotten, not just by the generation that experienced it, but by every generation after. And notice what the festival involved: feasting and gladness and giving gifts to one another and giving to the poor. The remembrance of God's deliverance was not private. It was social. It flowed outward. You could say that Purim is like what we celebrated yesterday, Independence Day, celebrating a deliverance from tyranny. And we celebrate to remember the price of freedom so that we never forget how we got here. Eugene Peterson writes this about Purim, and it's really moving. He says, life together is celebrated as a joyous gift, snatched unbelievably from the gates of death and hell. A people who had faced the possibility of not being are emphatically alive. Community is not explained in historical terms. It is not analyzed in sociological terms. It is enjoyed in the language and the rituals and the food and the laughter of a festival. In fact, the fact is that decimated and dispersed as the Jewish communities were, they were not swallowed up by the ocean of pagan power and culture and religion. They survived by grace. The empire did not. So here's some calls to action for us. What has God turned around in your life? Was there a date or a season that was once remarked by sorrow that has been redeemed? If you can think of something like that, tell somebody, write it down, celebrate it. Create a Purim in your own life, a habit of remembrance. Maybe it's a conversation with your family each year. Maybe it's a journal entry you reread. But don't let the story of God's faithfulness to you go untold. Someone in your life needs to hear it. Your kids, your grandkids, your neighbor, your mailman. Somebody needs to hear that. I had an encounter yesterday. We were kind of doing this. Tracy had the idea to get some family pictures of my parents with all of their kids and the grandkids, and printed them out and going to make an album so that my dad and my mom can look at these and just hold them, And so we printed off. Actually, we had 99 pictures, and I looked at Walgreens, and if you print 100 or more, it's half price. So I found the 100th picture and added it to the thing. So, little tip for you: print 100 pictures, they're only 15 cents a piece. So I went up, they texted me, I went up to Walgreens and picked them up, and I started telling the lady, what we're doing this for, and what my dad was going through. And we just had this time of her remembering her mom when her mom died, and it was just this kind of God thing, that we shared this moment of pictures and what our parents mean to us and the history of everything. And, it took me 30 minutes to pick up instant print pictures, but it was worth it, Well, here's another illustration of what we're talking about. In the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Monmouth, the American troops were in bad shape. They were retreating. The lines were breaking. Soldiers were discouraged. It looked less like a battle plan and more like the world's largest group project that nobody had prepared for. And then George Washington rode into the field. He stopped the retreat. He reorganized the troops. He encouraged the soldiers. And it turned what looked like a complete disaster into a battle that changed the confidence of the entire army. Sometimes all the difference is that the right leader shows up. And that exactly is what happened in Esther. If you stopped reading halfway through the book, you'd think, well, that ain't going to go so good. The decree was signed, the execution date was set, the gallows, the 75-foot stake was built. Haman was probably measuring them twice to make sure they were tall enough, And he was absolutely convinced that he had the last word. And then God quietly flipped the script. The man who planned the execution became the one who was executed. The people preparing for funerals ended up planning a feast. The date everyone dreaded became a celebration they remembered for generations and still to this day. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is assuming that because God has been quiet, he has been absent. In Esther, he never speaks, but he is working on every page. In our lives, when everything seems to be going wrong in the wrong direction, remember this: God has a long history of making the fourth quarter a lot more interesting than the first 3 quarters of our life. So here's what the book of Esther shows us about God. He is at work in the details you cannot see. He can redeem the very day the enemy appointed for your destruction. There is strength in community with praying and fasting together. He turns mourning into joy, not by erasing the hard thing, but by sanctifying it, by setting it apart. He does this through people who are willing to say, if I perish, I perish. Esther didn't have all the answers. She didn't have a guarantee. She had a calling, a covenant people behind her in prayer, and a God who was working in a palace she couldn't see into. And the result, generations later, is a feast. The festival of Purim is still celebrated around the world in Jewish communities. What God did has never stopped being remembered. So let me ask you today in closing, what might God do through your courage today that generations from now will still be celebrated? What might God do through your courage today that generations from now will still be celebrating? That's kind of intimidating. Even as I was preparing this, I was like, oh, I don't know if I have that much courage. But we read these stories, and it seems like these are just regular folks like us. And God works and